There is a nurse in Columbus, Ohio, named Dana, who has not missed a paycheck in 11 years. She earns more now than when she started. She has been promoted twice. Her direct deposit arrives every 2 weeks without fail. And yet, when she reviews her accounts on a Sunday evening, the number staring back is almost identical to what it was 5 years ago. The income is real, the progress is not. This is not a story about careless spending. Dana drives a 10-year-old sedan. She packs lunch. She has never carried credit card debt for more than a month. What Dana is experiencing is something that millions of working Americans encounter but struggle to name. A condition in which the paycheck arrives consistently, the obligations consume it reliably, and the cycle resets as though nothing was earned at all. The money moves, the position holds still. Across the United States and much of the developed world, a quiet structural contradiction has taken root. Employment, the institution most associated with financial security, has, for a growing share of households, become a mechanism that sustains economic participation without producing lasting economic advancement. The paycheck still carries the symbolic authority of the post-war contract. Work steadily, earn incrementally, accumulate over time. But for many, the underlying arithmetic no longer supports that trajectory. The signal says progress. The system delivers maintenance. Most households operate under a sequential assumption: secure a job, earn raises over time, save incrementally, retire with accumulated assets. This framework treats the paycheck as the primary engine of household wealth and assumes that income growth, even if modest, will outpace the rising cost of a middle-class life. It is the organizing logic behind career planning, mortgage applications, and retirement projections. And for the generation that built the post-war middle class, it was largely accurate. A related assumption compounds the first. When wages rise in nominal terms, most workers interpret it as genuine improvement. A larger number on the deposit slip feels like forward motion. But that reading rarely accounts for the simultaneous rise in housing costs, healthcare premiums, childcare, and education debt. Obligations that may have absorbed the entire raise before it reached a savings account. The surface belief conflates a bigger paycheck with a better financial position. In many cases, they are not the same. The deeper pattern involves a divergence that has unfolded over decades. Across developed economies, the growth rate of labor income has trailed the appreciation of financial assets, real estate, and other stores of value. This is not a temporary dislocation. It is a structural feature of how modern economies distribute gains. Households that rely primarily on wages fall progressively further behind households that hold appreciating assets, even when both groups are employed, even when both groups are earning. The paycheck, in this context, functions less as a wealth-building instrument and more as a liquidity event. Money arrives, fixed obligations, housing, insurance, transportation, debt service, consume an increasing share. What remains offers less margin for saving or investment than it did in prior decades. The paycheck covers the cost of participating in the economy. The surplus available for getting ahead has compressed. If this kind of structural economic analysis is what you look for in financial content, long-form, calm, and built on systems rather than headlines, subscribing is the simplest way to see more of it. This arrangement did not emerge overnight. In the decades following the Second World War, wage growth tracked productivity growth with reasonable fidelity. A single income could finance homeownership, household expenses, and modest retirement savings. Employer-sponsored pensions provided a financial backstop that required no individual investment expertise. The paycheck, in that era, genuinely functioned as a wealth accumulation tool. It was not an illusion. It was an accurate signal. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through each subsequent decade, several shifts eroded that relationship. Productivity gains increasingly accrued to capital rather than labor. Defined benefit pensions gave way to defined contribution plans, transferring investment risk to individuals. Healthcare costs shifted onto employees. Housing in productive metropolitan areas appreciated faster than wages. Each shift was incremental. Collectively, they transformed the paycheck from a wealth accumulator into a maintenance instrument, sufficient to sustain a household's current position, but increasingly insufficient to improve it. Consumer credit masked this transition for years. Mortgage debt, student loans, and revolving credit allowed households to maintain consumption patterns that wages alone could no longer support. The appearance of prosperity held. Underneath, debt was quietly substituting for income growth. A further layer involves the tax and benefits architecture that most workers rarely examine. Payroll taxes fall disproportionately on earned income. Investment income, by contrast, is taxed under a different and often more favorable structure. This means the effective return on an hour of labor is reduced by a mechanism that does not equally apply to an hour of capital appreciation. Meanwhile, the most powerful wealth compounding tools, equity ownership, real estate appreciation, tax-advantaged retirement accounts, are most accessible to those who already possess surplus income or inherited capital. The system does not explicitly prevent wage earners from building wealth, but its incentive architecture tilts meaningfully toward those who already hold assets. Dana in Columbus experiences this architecture every pay period without necessarily seeing it. Her paycheck is taxed at the point of earning. Her rent builds equity for her landlord. Her student loan payments service debt incurred to access the credential that secured her current position. She's employed, productive, and disciplined, and the structural math still works against her accumulation at every step. This channel exists to make structural economic patterns visible, the kind that operate beneath daily headlines. If that perspective matters to you, consider joining. The illusion operates most powerfully among middle-income earners. These are households earning enough to feel economically functional, enough to cover monthly obligations, maintain a reasonable standard of living, perhaps even take a vacation, but not enough to generate the meaningful surplus that converts into appreciating assets. This cohort is vast. It includes professionals, skilled tradespeople, public sector employees, and service workers who identify as financially stable while carrying little in assets relative to their obligations. Younger workers in their 20s and 30s face a compounded version. They entered the labor force after education costs had risen substantially, after housing in major employment centers had moved beyond easy reach, and after the employer-employee relationship had shifted toward less stable arrangements. For this group, the gap between what the paycheck promises and what it delivers may be wider than at any point in the post-war era. And the illusion is not confined to moderate earners. Higher-income professionals frequently experience lifestyle inflation, rising income absorbed by proportionally rising obligations. A larger house, a second vehicle, private schooling. The nominal paycheck grows. The net financial position holds still. The illusion scales. When a large portion of the workforce experiences stagnant real progress despite continuous employment, the effects ripple outward. Deferred marriage, delayed childbearing, extended cohabitation with parents. These follow from the gap between income and the cost of independence, with long-term implications for housing demand, consumer spending, and labor force composition. Credit markets absorb the pressure. Households use debt to bridge the distance between earnings and expectations. This sustains consumption short-term, but increases fragility during contractions. The sensitivity of consumer spending to interest rate movements grows as debt-to-income ratios rise across the distribution. Labor markets respond in kind. The search for higher wages drives job turnover, geographic mobility, and credential inflation, each carrying costs that erode the net benefit of employment gains. Secondary employment and gig work have expanded partly because primary wages no longer cover household financial objectives. The illusion generates its own economy of workarounds. And the political landscape reflects this tension. Debates over minimum wages, student debt, housing affordability, and healthcare are, at their structural root, expressions of the same recognition. That employment alone no longer guarantees the trajectory previous generations experienced. The most common misinterpretation is that insufficient income is the core problem and higher income is the solution. This leads to the predictable response: pursuing raises, chasing promotions, switching employers for marginally better compensation. These actions are rational, but they operate within the system that produces the illusion. They address the symptom, not enough money, rather than the cause: the diminishing conversion rate between wages and lasting wealth. A second misinterpretation is that awareness constitutes a solution. The proliferation of personal finance content reflects mass recognition that something is misaligned. But consuming information about the problem is not the same as changing one's structural position. Awareness without allocation, without redirecting income toward appreciating assets, generates anxiety without producing change. Understanding the structural nature of this dynamic is itself a form of positioning. The illusion persists partly because it is rarely described as a systemic feature. It is typically framed as individual failure: not saving enough, not earning enough, not being disciplined enough. Recognizing that the gap between wages and wealth is architectural allows for more precise, less self-punishing decision-making. Long-term positioning in this environment favors consistent acquisition of appreciating assets, however modest the initial amounts. The compounding properties of equity markets and tax-advantaged accounts operate independently of wage levels, provided participation is sustained over time. The earlier an individual begins converting even small portions of income into assets, the more effectively they offset the structural headwind. Reducing fixed obligations relative to income, particularly housing costs and debt service, preserves the margin that makes asset accumulation possible. This is not austerity. It is structural awareness, understanding which expenses build equity and which merely maintain the cycle. Developing income sources that are not purely wage-dependent. Investment returns, rental income, intellectual property, business ownership is the most direct response to the paycheck illusion. The objective is not to leave employment. It is to ensure employment income is supplemented by sources that participate in asset price growth rather than trailing it. And perhaps most importantly, extending the decision-making horizon. The illusion is invisible at short timescales. Month to month, the paycheck feels functional. But over a decade or more, the divergence between wage-dependent and asset-supported households becomes unmistakable. Patience and structural awareness are the most reliable counterweights. If this is the kind of financial thinking that aligns with how you approach your own decisions, structural, patient, grounded in systems, this channel was built for that perspective. Subscribing helps it reach others who think the same way. Dana will go to work on Monday morning. She will care for her patients with the same competence she has shown for over a decade. Her paycheck will arrive on schedule. The number will be correct. And the distance between that number and the financial life it was supposed to build will remain exactly what it was the month before. She is not failing. The signal she was taught to trust, that a steady paycheck in a stable career produces financial progress, was accurate once. It described a system that existed. The architecture changed. The signal has not. The paycheck is real. What it purchases, in terms of lasting economic position, is the part that has quietly shifted. And the first step toward navigating that shift is simply recognizing that it happened at all.